Priya Parker, the author of The Art of Gathering, tells the story of a time that she ended up at an awkward dinner party. There were about a dozen people around the table, and not everyone knew each other, so the host had decided that they would begin with a simple icebreaker, where the guests each had to guess the other's occupations. Each person would get one guess per person, and the guest in question would reveal their job, then they would move on to the next person. People started playing and they were laughing at all the random guesses that people were coming up with, and things were going pretty well until the host got up to check on dinner. And at that point, that guy commandeered the party. You know, that guy, one of the louder guests who claimed the center of attention for himself, started giving himself multiple guesses, asked follow-up questions, and offered unnecessary commentary. 40 minutes into this icebreaker, they had only gotten through 2 people. And this by now awkward and painful game ended up lasting the entire dinner as people muttered under their breath and looked for their first opportunity to exit. Parker was using this story as a way to make a point about good hosting. But there's another truth at play here. Some people are just bad dinner guests. As Luke tells the story of Jesus' life, Jesus loves dinner parties. From today's reading, however, it begins to dawn on us. Jesus was sometimes a pretty bad dinner guest. We've been following Jesus on his way to Jerusalem from the Mount of Transfiguration for several weeks now. And during this time, crowds have continued to follow Jesus, and he has continued to teach and tell stories and cast out demons as he goes. And on this particular day, when he is teaching the crowds, a Pharisee invites him over to dinner. And this is the beginning of what might be the most awkward dinner party ever. You might remember that Jesus has some history with the Pharisees, who represent a prominent Jewish sect of the time, concerned with what it meant to follow God's law in contemporary life. Jesus first gets the attention of Pharisees early in his ministry in Galilee, as his teaching and miracles begin to attract crowds. And Pharisees come from all over to see what's up with this new preacher in town. And apparently some of them feel threatened, especially by his seemingly cavalier attitude towards Sabbath law. For much of Luke's gospel, the Pharisees are depicted as lying in wait, ready to catch Jesus in anything that will get him in real trouble. So, you might be thinking, what's a Pharisee doing inviting Jesus over for dinner? It's possible that he's trying to get Jesus close enough to trap him, and that Jesus, for whatever reason, is willing to take the bait. It's also possible, though, that the dynamics are more complicated than that. As one of my commentaries reminded me this week, Jesus and Pharisees had much in common. They worship together. They eat together sometimes. This is, in fact, not the first time. And in fact, in chapter 13 of Luke, it will be Pharisees that warn Jesus that King Herod is after him. There are scholars who even argue that Jesus himself was historically a Pharisee. Now, there's no question that in the Synoptic Gospels, and in Luke especially, the Pharisees act as a foil to Jesus and his message. In the background, though, there may be more going on than that. So maybe it's not so weird that a Pharisee would invite Jesus to dinner. Now, things admittedly do not go well. It begins when Jesus doesn't wash his hands. Look, we have all had the importance of hand hygiene drilled into us for the past 2 years, so one can understand why Jesus might get some side eye on that. Pharisees had rules around ritual purity and cleanliness, and in many cases would only eat with those who kept the same rules. So I don't know if Jesus just isn't in the habit of washing his hands the way the Pharisees do, or if he is intentionally trying to start something here. And to be honest, it seems like he might be intentionally trying to start something here. In any case, his Pharisee host is offended. "You Pharisees," says Jesus in response, "you're always so concerned with external cleanliness, but inside you're just filled with greed and wickedness." Again, I don't know if something just set Jesus off here after a long day, or if he's had this speech prepared and has just been waiting for his chance. In any case, I can imagine the rest of the guests seated around this dinner table grabbing their popcorn. Jesus is just getting started. "Woe to you, Pharisees," he continues. "You make sure to tithe on every little herb that counts as part of your income, but you don't actually care about the big things like love and justice. You should care about both. Woe to you, Pharisees, always clamoring for status and honor from those around you. Woe to you! You are like unmarked graves. You make people unclean by your very proximity, and they don't even know it." Again, Jesus really has an uncanny ability to ruin a party. And again, we should be careful about the broad brush with which we often paint the Pharisees, who are seen as the forerunners of modern rabbinic Judaism. And yet Jesus' tirade here is worth listening to. In these words, he channels the ancient prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, who warned God's people that God didn't care about their religious festivals and sacrifices and outer acts of piety if these things weren't accompanied by sharing with the poor, freeing the oppressed, and caring for the most vulnerable in their society. Now, at this point, another dinner guest speaks up, a lawyer or a law expert. These are characters who pop up in Luke from time to time, who aren't Pharisees, but who seem to usually be associated with them. "Jesus," he says, "you realize you're talking about us too here, right?" And Jesus turns to him and says, "Oh, don't even get me started on you lawyers." "Woe to you lawyers," he says. "You load people down with burdens they can never carry, and you don't even do anything to help. Woe to you lawyers. Your ancestors killed the prophets that you now honor with fancy tombs. Woe to you. You've taken the key of knowledge away from people who are trying to enter, and you haven't even entered yourself." It's easy, I know, to make a passage like this into Jesus versus Judaism, or Jesus versus the oppressive Jewish law. It is not about that. Jesus is a Jew who still attends synagogue every Saturday. He thinks these Pharisees should be tithing on their herbs and also attending to bigger matters of love and justice. What Jesus is against, and we've talked about this before, is an approach to the law that isn't life-giving. What he's against is religious hypocrisy. He's against people who claim to believe or do or stand for or care about one thing while their lives tell a different story. And let me tell you, no one religion or sect or political group has a monopoly on these people. One of my commentaries reminded me that stories like this have a double function in Luke. On the one hand, they explain Jesus' conflict with the religious authorities of his day. And on the other hand, they serve as a warning to Christian readers not to fall into the traps of false piety. Or as another writer put it, were not the church of Luke's time already falling victim to these ancient errors, there would have been little reason to report Jesus' mealtime conversation. I'm sure that it will come as no surprise to most of you to hear that one of the most frequent accusations leveled against Christians or the church today from those who are outside it, sometimes even from those who are inside it, is that of hypocrisy. We claim to believe in Jesus, but we don't do a good job of loving people like Jesus said. We're obsessed with purity rules about sex, while being complacent about things like poverty and injustice. We seek power and status in society, using our religious identity for political gain rather than for sacrifice and service. And for sure, sometimes some of those accusations are warranted. Back in the spring of last year, a group of us read the book White Too Long by Robert Jones, which detailed all the ways that Christianity has been and still is not just complacent about racism in our society, but actually a force for perpetuating and building up white supremacy generation after generation. I think of Christians who quote Martin Luther King Jr. and visit his memorial, but then also show up at school board meetings to protest honest depictions of racism in American history. Your ancestors killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. But of course, that's not us, right? Those are other Christians. We know them, maybe. We read about them in the news, but we're not them. We are a diverse community of people who cherish and respect our different backgrounds, who don't tend to get into fights about the color of the carpet when there are people literally sleeping outside our doors, who do our best to not only serve the poor in our community, but to also welcome them in. And let me be clear, in many ways, I think those things are true. This here is not a perfect community, but it is a good one. But you didn't come here today to hear about how other people are hypocrites. These commentaries remind me, Jesus' words are a message for us. We, after all, are part of a denomination that for years has spent much of its energy fighting about the rules around LGBTQ folks instead of focusing on our mission around the world. We, after all, make sure our hungry neighbors are fed, but perhaps don't always do much as a community to address the systems that create poverty and inequality in our society. We, after all, take pride in the diversity of our community, but still decorate our walls with pictures of a white Jesus. And I know Jesus' words are a message for me. I, after all, am half-hearted sometimes in living out the things that I say I believe. Maybe one of our jobs for the season of Lent is to reflect on how Jesus' words of woe might apply to us, and how it might look to really organize our lives around Jesus' teachings and example of love and mercy and justice. Now, look, I don't think that Jesus needs us to be perfect. I think he wants our hearts to be in the right place. I think he wants us to grow in love and holiness as God gives us grace to do so. And I think that when we start worrying too much about getting it all right all the time, we get back into that place of making rules and trivial things our God. We're not going to be perfect. Certainly not all at once. There's grace for that. But there's nothing wrong with taking stock, right? Luke tells us that after this ill-fated dinner party, the Pharisees and lawyers become hostile to Jesus, and they plot again to trap him. But maybe we can hear Jesus' message without rushing to the defensive. What is it that makes a person clean? Care for the poor, practicing love and justice, having humility, thinking more of others than ourselves. May we do our best to follow Jesus along this path a little more every day, just as we claim to do. Just let's think twice about inviting him over to dinner. Amen.